Welcome back to Morning Joy, where truth matters. I'm your host, Keith Downey, and as a question, would you let your son be a priest? Would you let your daughter be a sister or a nun or religious, consecrated religious? Would you or would you not? We're curious to know. Give us a call. The lines are open for just a little bit here, 877-757-9424. And maybe you do have a child who's living out religious vocation. How did you help them? How did you get them started? We want to know, because I'm sure there's parents out there who may be a little bit apprehensive about pushing them in that manner. But yes, we're going to be focusing on this topic that really shapes our lives as Catholics, vocations, and myself as a millennial. I call myself a geriatric millennial because I'm one of the older styles of millennials out there. I didn't really have much of an extensive exposure to vocations beyond marriage growing up. My parents did a wonderful job, and I saw that, and I'm like, yeah, I want that. And interestingly enough, I went to Catholic school, and there were priests, there were nuns, sisters at these schools, but discussions on discerning vocations to the religious life were essentially non-existent. I don't know why. But the truth is, God does call each of us to a unique purpose. Debbie and Adam really honed in on it incredibly well. So if maybe you missed that portion of Morning Joy, I highly recommend going back maybe a little bit later today. We'll have just that segment for you to listen onto or watch. Just make sure to search Morning Joy on any of the social medias. But there really is a wonderfully beautiful spectrum of vocations within the Catholic Church that I think it's, may need like a little primer, maybe going back to basics on these. Now, we all know the priestly vocation, right? It's pretty well recognized. I just keep thinking about my own experiences with that. And once again, never really thought about it growing up, that it would be an option. Was that your case? If you do have something, maybe a similar story, you can feel free to give us a call. That number is 877-757-9424. I got a question for you, though, Tim, our senior producer. Now, you are a convert. Were you aware of all these different vocations as you came into the Catholic Church?
Absolutely not. No, no. I knew that priests were a thing. I grew up as a Baptist pastor's kid, so there was all this kind of like, you had an idea of God putting a calling on your life, but that meant not so much kind of a state in life as more of a grand purpose. Like maybe your calling is to be a plumber, or maybe your calling is to be a pastor, maybe your calling is to be a missionary. And then it's just like everyone's got a calling, but it's like an individualized purpose. It's not like it wasn't a thing where there's a method of discerning it, and there is like a group that you can join, and like the church that's guiding you into it. So becoming Catholic, it was a new experience for me to be thinking in terms of like, whoa, okay, so we've got priests, we've got religious sisters, and we've got monks, and then marriage. As thinking of that as a vocation, it was a new idea for me.
That's so interesting. I would always assume that no matter the Christian religion, there was always something like this. But you're right. It's not really honed in. And there's the LDS Church. They're really focused on marriage. But if there's someone who's single, it's not really. I don't know. I don't want to say looked down upon, but it's just a very interesting aspect. But kind of going back to just some of these different vocations that one can look to. Religious life, you mentioned it, Tim, there. Now, obviously, this encompasses men and women who dedicate their lives to God through whether it be prayer, service, and community living. There are numerous religious orders out there, a lot. And this is kind of like, I'm not only kind of scratching the surface here because it would take far too long to go through each and every single order or religious order, but they all have their own charism and focus. So when we're talking about religious brothers, men who live in a community, dedicate themselves to prayer and service, maybe not become priests though, right? So maybe they're contemplative monks, maybe they're active brothers, maybe someone wants to become a friar. There's just so many different aspects of that, as well as for the women out there, religious sisters. Now, same kind of setup. They live in communities dedicated themselves to prayer, service, so on and so forth. One example, actually, great example of one individual would be Sister Orion, who actually we interviewed a few months ago, and she's a Pauline nun. So this community is called the Daughters of St. Paul.
I love that one of their charisms is media.
Yes.
Yeah. So it's not like it's like that's kind of the thing that their state in life is being a sister, but then their kind of purpose or career is that charism is the media thing.
Exactly. And it's I think even like thinking of myself, it was just like, okay, so I could become a priest. And that was like the extent of it. There was no like, well, there's so many different orders. And even I'm sure there's women out there who felt the same, like, oh, I could be a sister or a nun and then that be it. Like there's no charism that's really thought of. But like you said, Tim, the Daughters of St. Paul, they really hone into sharing Christ's love with the people of today through the media. So very, very important. And like I said, I'm just scratching the surface on this. Obviously, marriage, enough said about that. But one that really isn't touched on, or actually two, would be the consecrated virginity or a consecrated virgin. Now, this vocation allows women to dedicate their lives to God through perpetual virginity while remaining in the world, not so much living in a religious community, but living out in the world. And this is typically they're consecrated by like a local bishop through a special rite. So very interesting. And then obviously the single life. Once again, that one doesn't get that much exposure as well. And obviously it's not for everyone, but it's living the single life for the sake of the kingdom of God, a valid vocation where they can dedicate themselves to serving God and others through various ministries and volunteer work. Now, this has been kind of a subject throughout the entire show is contemplation and discernment. So similar to what Deb and Adam were talking about, having this innate desire to connect with God really can only help clear your vocational path. Prayer, reflection, talking to spiritual directors are key. That's another thing, Tim, that I didn't really know about until somewhat recent, last 10 years, is having someone to talk to, spiritual direction. How incredible it is to have somebody to kind of guide you through your spiritual life. I don't mind sharing my first encounter with spiritual direction. Now, this was maybe a couple of years ago, actually, and it's my pastor is my spiritual director, and I was worried. I was like going to sweat. I'm like sweating. I'm like, what is he going to ask? He's going to ask me about all my personal spiritual life. And he's really like, yeah, so what's your prayer life like? And I'm like, well, I do this and this and this. He's like, okay, all right. Why don't you just start off with praying the rosary? Like, just get that down. I'm like, okay, I can do that. I can just pray the rosary. And then he's like, okay, and then we'll come back and then we'll talk more about what you can add on top of that. But I really want you to focus on the rosary and then, we'll go from there. So
do you think that like being parents, you're kind of the spiritual directors for your kids?
That is a really good, I would say.
I hadn't thought of that before, but you kind of sparked that idea in me.
Essentially parents are kind of the first spiritual directors of their children because you're basically showing them how to live as a Catholic, right? Or a Christian. And you're showing them all of the prayers, all of the motions, especially at Mass. So that's a really good point, Tim, that, as parents, we are initially their first spiritual directors or direction. Now, obviously, as they grow up, they may not want to listen to their parents or, so on and so forth. But that's why it's, I do have a couple of sources that one could go to, especially maybe if they have a child or grandchild, maybe a little bit lost and maybe they need some spiritual direction. Dan Burke, who's actually the father of Jordan Burke, who we've had on the show, they have a website called spiritualdirection.com. So if you don't have a Holy Orthodox priest or maybe a deacon out there or maybe a religious sister or maybe a solid lay person to have that spiritual direction, recommend going to that website. They'll help parse through that for you. Another great resource, maybe to send or give away to a family member who might be discerning whether or not they want to do a religious vocation or not, is searching, just type in the word vocations within the USCCB's website. They have quite a bit of links, one pertaining to men, right? So it has quite a few different links. It also has some videos with Bishop Barron talking about vocation life of the priesthood. So he's a great speaker on the subject. And then there's for women, it's kind of the same kind of subjects. Like these are the different types of vocations. Here are some orders you can look into, examine, really do that, almost like an examination of your vocation. So that way, we don't want you living out a life wondering what if. I think that's kind of the idea. We don't want you to have that what if moment at the end. Like, what if I could have done this? What if I could have done that? That's why that's why it's so important for us to have great contributors like Debbie Georgiani, Adam Bly, Monsignor Charles Pope, so on and so forth, because they really do help us do the next right thing, living out an authentic Catholic faith. What do you think about that, Tim?
Oh yeah, absolutely. But one thing that you made me think of is the part of that spiritual direction for the kids is actually exposing them to this discernment process and letting them know that they need to figure out where God's calling them to. You said that as a cradle Catholic, I mean, I know you have 30 seconds left, but you said as a cradle Catholic, you had never been exposed to that. So we should like challenge the listeners to actually, maybe today or this week, if whatever age their kids are, just say, hey, have you ever thought about being a priest? Or if they're like 5, then you could say, oh yeah, there's priests and sisters. I mean, but it's our job as parents to do that.
Yeah. Absolutely. And getting involved at your local parish as well, whether, it's their son serving the Mass, get them familiar with that. Or, if there's anything else for girls out there, there's like prayer, like rosary groups I know out there, and just getting them involved with their peers. It's very helpful because then they can have some conversations about that. But my goodness, that's it for Morning Joy, where truth matters. It's been an exciting Monday morning, the first day of July. It's the month of the precious blood, so it's going to be it's going to be a great month here on Morning Joy. I'm really excited for everyone involved. But if you are on your way to the Holy Mass, of course, continue to pray for us. Maybe you're dropping your kids off at work, so on and so forth. If that's the case, we'll see you bright and early tomorrow, Tuesday morning, 6 a.m. Central, 7 a.m. Eastern. But hey, there's an after-show clubhouse happening right after this. It's a little bit more intimate, a little bit more relaxed. Just search Morning Joy, and you'll find us on YouTube, Facebook. But until then, God bless, and make it a joyful day. See ya.
This has been Morning Joy, where truth matters, hosted by Keith Downey. Take some joy with you today. Visit grnonline.com/joy to listen again, share a segment, or answer the question of the day. That's grnonline.com/joy.